Welcome to the Emisarios Unidos de Luz channel. If you enjoy this near-death experience story, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Now let's start with the story. My NDE occurred when I was a teenager, during an operation to remove a tumor from my adrenal gland. After I was administered the anesthetic, I very suddenly found myself floating near the ceiling, but beneath the powerful lamps that illuminated the operating theater. Although I was only a few meters above the operation, it felt as though I were in a cathedral, with the ceiling towering far above me. As I hovered over the bustling activity, I watched doctors and even medical students arrive to observe the operation for a rare condition. Ordinarily, such a situation would have unnerved me, yet in my heightened state of awareness, I remained unaffected by the commotion. In that state of profound peace, I looked down at my body, seeing it as a machine I had used for a time to accomplish certain tasks. With my consciousness elevated, I understood that I was the integration of multiple aspects coming together to form a singular, multi-dimensional being, and from that vantage point, I had become separated from the individual I had been for the past 16 years. In that superconscious state, I could feel the emotions specific to each individual within the operating room, as well as the nervous anticipation and excitement shared by all. I also knew details about people's pasts, and when I focused on the lead surgeon, I understood that, despite his extensive experience, he had performed the operation only once before. As the room suddenly became enveloped in tense silence, I watched the lead surgeon make his incision, cutting deeply but with precision, avoiding unnecessary exposure or contact with the adrenal gland, knowing that such contact would trigger the release of a large amount of hormones with unpredictable results. Even though the surgeon planned to remove the tumor, I knew in my state of heightened awareness that he wasn't aware how pervasively the tumor had filled the medulla and the degree to which it had metastasized. After some deliberation about whether to proceed, the lead surgeon made the incision. However, as the scalpel touched the gland, a massive dose of adrenaline was released, causing the heart monitor to emit a high-pitched alarm. It was at that moment that I felt a surge of lightning-fast energy expand outward as a wave of panic gripped the room. In the wake of the explosion, time stretched to infinity to the point where the scene beneath me appeared like a photograph of people with intertwined hands, passing various items to one another as they scurried to implement the emergency procedure. While the people beneath me were preoccupied, I felt a powerful force pulling me from behind, and as I was drawn by that irresistible force, time seemed to speed up, as if compensating for the earlier slowdown. For the briefest moment, I could hear the screams of people panicking as chaos unfolded beneath me, before I was suddenly whisked away at full speed through a pitch-black tunnel. With my attention fixed on the light far ahead, a small yellow sphere of light suddenly approached, and just as suddenly, my journey through the tunnel came to an end. It was then that I began to fall, and it felt as though I had fallen some distance before coming to a stop in a strange place. In that place, above and below felt relative to my orientation, much like in space, and the dense, foggy atmosphere seemed to glow with a milky yellow hue. Suddenly, 5 yellow, human-looking light beings appeared in front of me, the leader of whom seemed to be female, and whose facial features I could discern more clearly when I didn't try to focus on them. Radiating a warm and welcoming energy as we communicated telepathically, those beings took me to a strange place in the middle of the yellow fog. I then watched as 3 perfect spheres arranged themselves to form an equilateral triangle, and in the middle of the triangle, I saw another much larger sphere. I asked the beings what it was that I was looking at, but they didn't respond. I noticed the yellow fog gradually change in hue to dark blue before turning black, and in that transformation from day to night, I was able to see the stars in the sky. The beings instructed me to turn, and as I did, I was stunned by how beautiful and how surprisingly alive Earth looked from a distance. As I admired Earth, hundreds of small spinning objects suddenly appeared before me. One type of those spinning objects appeared ugly and menacing, its ridiculously distorted antediluvian form seeming to be assembled from an infinite number of parts. I saw within and around orbs that appeared to be beautifully crafted, living beings, and as I focused my attention on them, 3 or 4 types of those beings suddenly appeared before me, beings who stood 2.5 to 3 meters tall, watching me from some device. "Who are you?" I asked them. "Your friends," they replied. The beings then pointed towards the earth, and when I turned to look in that direction, I saw a blue laser-like beam of light pass through the earth before continuing on its journey through the cosmos. The earth then began to glow with a beautiful blue halo, and I felt a great liveliness emanate from it as the beings of the earth radiated energies of peace, happiness, and joyful enthusiasm. It was then that I felt the tug of Earth's gravity pulling me back, away from my friends, whom I barely managed to bid farewell to. As I flew towards the Earth at high speed, I found myself once again in that place of yellow fog, the place beyond time. My group was positioned beside me when two boys, aged 7 and 14, appeared before me, welcoming me. The boys then proceeded to take me to another strange place, which initially looked like a model in the midst of the yellow fog. What first appeared as a model, however, transformed, or perhaps I transformed, such that I could suddenly enter it, and as soon as I did, the model and everything it contained became quite real. Suddenly, I found myself in the middle of a hilly area by the side of a large lake. It was early autumn, and we sat down on the shore to observe the nature around us. I watched as the leaves of the trees yellowed and fell to the ground, while the rain and cold made the atmosphere foggy. This continued for a long time before the rain stopped and winter set in. During that winter, I observed the snow falling and the lake freezing over. Winter seemed to endure for a very long time, but finally, the water in the brooks began to flow again, and the ice on the lake started to crackle deafeningly as spring arrived. In the middle of spring, I saw nature in bloom, followed by a summer whose heat and humidity attracted swarms of insects. The boys then pointed to the right side of the lake, which passed under a hill, where I saw a very tall man looking downward despondently as he walked. The man, appearing to be between 40 and 45 years old, was leading a horse that was pulling a cart on his return from a 2 or 3 day journey to a neighboring city, where he had gone to sell his produce. Suddenly everything darkened, and it suddenly seemed as though I was looking at the world through his eyes. As I looked through his eyes, every aspect of his life became instantly known to me. I knew he was married and had 8 children, the youngest of whom was only an infant at the time. The man was a poor peasant who could barely support his family, yet among peasants, he was considered middle class. I also knew that his home was outside the city, that he cultivated the land for a living, and that he was fluent in French even though his mother tongue was German. As the man stood atop a hill to behold the gloomy grey middle-age hamlet at the center of the vast valley before him, he pondered the town and its narrow roads, which were deeply coated in a mixture of mud, animal waste, and human excrement. He also remembered how a dirty, toothless woman thrust something disgusting in his face that she was selling, and the dirty, pantless children who stared wide-eyed at him. As he made his way through the crowd to reach the center of the city, I saw through his eyes the citizens of the city gathered at the city square. The citizens stood gathered behind a cordon of armed soldiers, who blocked the crowd from approaching the gallows in the middle of the town square, where 4 people stood with nooses around their necks. As the man looked upon the faces of those about to be hanged, he noticed that one of them was his 14-year-old son, and I immediately recognized him as the older of the 2 boys who had beckoned me to enter the model. The man, upon realizing that one of the condemned was his son, let out a roar and rushed towards the gallows in a desperate attempt to save him, only to be intercepted by one of the knights, whose sword pierced his heart, causing him to fall and die instantly. Enraged by his murder, the crowd began to fight the soldiers, and a terrible slaughter ensued. The man's wife, among the gathered people, was then separated from her 7-year-old son in an attempt to protect him. One of the soldiers, however, upon seeing the boy, inexplicably beheaded him. I recognized that 7-year-old as the younger of the 2 boys who had beckoned me to enter the model. Suddenly, I found myself in a state of post-traumatic shock on the shore of the lake, while the children soothed me as I sat there, crying and shivering, recalling all that I had witnessed. I eventually regained my senses, and the 2 boys helped me retreat from the model to be reunited with the group of light beings who had been waiting for me. Suddenly, the atmosphere grew dark, and I became very frightened, even more so when I noticed the light beings starting to panic. "What's going on?" I shouted repeatedly, perturbed, while my friends regarded me with expressions of horror. It was at that moment, just as my destiny was about to be determined, that I suddenly heard a voice from very far away imploring me to calm down and reassuring me that everything was going to be okay. As I listened to the voice and managed to calm myself down, I noticed the ambience brighten again and the light beings regain their composure. In the illuminated atmosphere of the yellow fog, the children took me aside, and we had a conversation about the things I had yet to experience in my life. They warned me that I would forget everything we talked about. Then I found myself suddenly back in the operating theater, lying on the operating table. One of the medical staff was sewing the cut in my skin, but I wasn't able to move or say anything to let them know I was awake. I felt pain in front of my eyes as I watched the children wave goodbye to me from a distance in the yellow fog. "Soon, we will meet again," they kept repeating. I knew that even as a child, I had been in a very dark and unpleasant place for a long time, a hell, you could call it, due to a deleterious decision made in a past life. I also knew that I was supposed to die on the operating table. My sins were redeemed by God, however, and I was once again given the opportunity to continue living my human life, albeit as a person with a burdensome charge to bear. I now know for which deeds it was determined that retribution was to be imposed, but that is a story for another day. After that death experience, I woke up instantly as a new person, even though the change has been gradual. Today, however, I have a different understanding of the world, different priorities, and what I see as my duty. Spirituality and spiritual growth are significant components of my life, and without them, my life holds little meaning for me. The NDE gave me the ability to look both forward and backwards in time and to see, lamentably, that I wasn't a high-vibing person in my past lives. I want to emphasize that dying is not something special. Living and pursuing your life with purpose is so much more special and important. When I recounted my experiences during the NDE to my parents, my mother started crying as she explained that it was she who encouraged me to calm down in that critical moment during the operation by speaking to me inwardly. The last thing I want to say is that I believe in God and that God's essence embodies love, compassion, and forgiveness. God never refuses anything that is asked of him, but I believe he gives the most to those who desire to be close to him.